What if a single cruel gesture in an elegant restaurant, meant to mock without consequence, became the catalyst that shattered a powerful CEO's carefully constructed facade? When Blake Thompson silently insulted his black waitress Amara using sign language he thought no one would understand, he never imagined she could not only read his fingers but his lips too. Her unexpected response ignited a chain of events that would expose decades of hidden prejudice, transform both their lives, and prove that sometimes true power lies in the hands of those society overlooks. The crystal chandeliers of Le Chateau cast prismatic light across the white tablecloths and polished silver as Amara Jackson navigated between tables with practiced grace, balancing a silver tray of champagne flutes with one hand while tucking a stray curl back into her immaculate bun with the other. 3 advanced degrees in linguistics hung invisibly around her neck, weighted with student loans and the responsibility of supporting her grandmother and younger brother since their parents' accident 2 years ago. She approached table 7 with a professional smile that betrayed nothing of the exhaustion from her morning court transcription job, where she approached Blake Thompson and his circle of executives in tailored suits who barely glanced up as she arrived. Their laughter faded to smirks as Blake, the 50-year-old CEO of Thompson Media Enterprises with salt and pepper hair and cold blue eyes, caught their attention with a subtle gesture before his hands began to move in what he assumed was their private language. His fingers eloquently shaping a racial slur, followed by a derogatory joke about her appearance, his wedding ring catching the light with each cruel movement. The associate's eyes widened slightly, one nearly choking on his water while another bit his lip to suppress a chuckle, all of them complicit in this moment of privileged mockery, as Blake finished with a dismissive gesture that clearly conveyed his sense of superiority over the waitstaff, particularly one with skin darker than the mahogany panels surrounding them. Amara felt her chest tighten as her trained eye caught every nuanced movement, every deliberately shaped insult, her notepad momentarily frozen between her suddenly stiff fingers as 28 years of similar moments flashed through her mind in a familiar kaleidoscope of indignities weathered with forced grace. The silence stretched for precisely 3 seconds before her decision crystallized, her hands setting down the notepad with deliberate care before rising between them, her fingers flowing into perfect American Sign Language as she responded with flawless syntax, "I can read lips too, sir," while simultaneously speaking the words aloud in a clear, educated voice that carried just enough to turn heads at neighboring tables, without disrupting the restaurant's hushed atmosphere. Time seemed to stop, as Blake's expression transformed from smug satisfaction to horrified comprehension, the blood draining from his face so rapidly that the contrast with his white collar disappeared, his mouth opening slightly but producing no sound as his associates shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, suddenly finding the elaborate place settings fascinating while Amara maintained perfect posture and unbroken eye contact. "Now, what would you like to order?" She continued in the same professional tone, her pen poised above her notepad as if nothing unusual had transpired, though her heart hammered against her ribs with such force she feared they might hear it across the expanse of starched tablecloth and expensive china. The power in the interaction had shifted so palpably that even the sommelier paused while decanting wine at a nearby table, the entire section of the restaurant having felt, rather than heard, the sudden reversal of who held authority in this exchange, as Blake Thompson, whose media empire controlled news outlets across 3 states and whose signature appeared on paychecks for over 5,000 employees, found himself speechless before a waitress who had just demonstrated more dignity under pressure than he had shown in his entire public life. Friends, before we go further, may I ask a small favor? Please subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us keep bringing you these stories, and reaching 1,000 subscribers soon is so important for us to continue. We also love hearing from you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how our little storytelling circle is spreading across the world. And if you enjoyed the beginning, give this video a like and let's share thoughts on the whole story together below. Amara pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen where the cacophony of clanging pots and sizzling pans provided temporary cover as she pressed her back against the cool steel refrigerator, her carefully composed facade finally cracking as she fought to control the trembling in her hands while hot tears threatened to spill onto her starched black uniform. Within seconds, Maria from pastry and Jamal from the dish station flanked her protectively, creating a human barrier between her and the rest of the bustling kitchen as steam rose in ghostly columns around them and sous chefs barked orders over the symphony of culinary chaos. "I saw what happened out there," whispered Maria, passing her a clean kitchen towel as Amara took several deep breaths, the comforting scents of garlic and fresh herbs slowly bringing her back to center, while the weight of 20 pairs of eyes settled on her with collective concern. "It was nothing," Amara attempted, but her voice betrayed her with a slight crack before she continued more steadily. "I learned sign language when my brother lost his hearing at age 7, and then got certified as a court transcriber where reading lips is part of the job." As she straightened her posture and smoothed her apron with hands that had steadied enough to be functional again, though adrenaline still coursed through her veins like electricity through overwrought wires. Gabriel, the head chef whose tattooed arms and gruff exterior concealed a fiercely protective nature toward his staff, approached with thunderous eyebrows and lips pressed into a thin line as he wiped his hands on a towel that had once been white but now bore the multicolored evidence of his culinary artistry. "That man," he spat the word as if expelling something rotten, "comes here twice monthly to impress clients and treats my people like they're invisible. But he owns Thompson Media, which controls half the news outlets in this city, plus 3 radio stations and that new streaming platform, revealing the uncomfortable truth that hovered in the air between them unspoken until now." Blake Thompson wielded influence far beyond the walls of Le Chateau. Jamal gently squeezed her shoulder in silent solidarity, while busboys and line cooks paused their work just long enough to convey their support through nods and murmured encouragements before returning to their tasks. The momentary lull in kitchen activity quickly replaced by renewed vigor as orders continued to arrive from the dining room where unsuspecting patrons remained blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding behind the scenes. "I should quit," Amara whispered, more to herself than anyone else, but the words lacked conviction even as they left her lips. And Gabriel recognized the familiar steel beneath her momentary vulnerability, having witnessed similar scenes play out with other staff members who had suffered indignities at the hands of wealthy patrons who confused service with servitude. "Take 10 minutes, he ordered gruffly, though his eyes conveyed understanding rather than command, as he turned back to the line where a perfectly seared foie gras awaited his inspection, leaving Amara with her small circle of supporters. As she straightened her spine and wiped away the last evidence of her emotional response, "My grandmother raised me after my parents died," she shared quietly as she retied her apron strings with deliberate movements, "and she always said that you never let someone else's smallness define your worth." The simple wisdom falling into the kitchen's relative quiet during a rare lull between courses, her words carrying just far enough for the nearest staff to catch them and exchange knowing glances as Amara checked her appearance in the reflection of a polished pot, applied a fresh coat of the burgundy lipstick that was her small act of daily defiance, and pushed through those same swinging doors to return to the dining room where Blake Thompson still sat with his associates, her steps measured and her head held high, despite the knowledge that the remainder of her shift would be an exercise in endurance that required every ounce of the dignity her grandmother had instilled in her. Blake Thompson stabbed at the elevator button with uncharacteristic urgency, his normally commanding presence diminished by the slight tremor in his manicured hands as he barked orders at the remaining executives to handle the check, unable to stomach another minute in that dining room where several tables had witnessed his humiliation at the hands of a mere waitress. The sleek doors slid open with a discreet chime, and he stepped inside, alone at last with his reflection multiplied infinitely in the mirrored walls, each version of himself staring back with the same tight jaw and flushed complexion that betrayed his carefully cultivated image of unflappable control. He burst through the restaurant's side exit, just as fat raindrops began pelting the sidewalk, his Italian leather shoes splashing through puddles without his usual fastidious care as he waved impatiently at the valet, who scrambled to retrieve his black Tesla that materialized moments later with perfect timing, as if even the elements of chance knew better than to further inconvenience Blake Thompson on this rapidly deteriorating evening. Once sealed within the leather and carbon fiber cocoon of his vehicle, Blake jabbed at his phone screen while the city's neon signs and traffic lights smeared into watercolor streaks across his rain-spattered windows, the downtown skyline glittering with artificial stars that seemed to mock his darkening mood, as the call connected to his PR director, Melissa. "Drop whatever you're doing," he commanded without preamble, his voice tighter than usual as he accelerated through a yellow light. "I need you to prepare contingency plans for potential adverse publicity involving me personally." His knuckles whitening around the steering wheel as he recalled the silent restaurant patrons whose attention had been drawn to his table by that waitress's pointed response to his private joke. Melissa's voice remained professionally calm as she inquired about the specifics while Blake could hear her fingers already tapping at her keyboard, preparing to contain whatever damage her employer had created this time, a skill she had refined to an art form during her 7 years managing the public image of a man whose private behavior rarely matched his polished media persona. His personal assistant, Kevin, who had remained on the conference call as protocol required, cleared his throat nervously before interrupting, "Sir, I've just run a preliminary background on the server from Le Chateau," the tapping of his keyboard audible through the Bluetooth speakers as Blake navigated through increasingly heavy rain, windshield wipers struggling against the downpour that matched his spiraling anxiety. "Her name is Amara Jackson, and she's not just a waitress," Kevin continued, his voice rising slightly, as it always did when delivering unwelcome news. "She's a certified court interpreter with specialized credentials in American Sign Language and lip reading who regularly works with the district courts and is completing her PhD in linguistics at the City University, where she maintains a 4.0 GPA while supporting her younger brother and grandmother." Blake's stomach clenched as the implications crystallized in his mind, his car hydroplaning slightly on the rain-slicked street as he took a corner too sharply, causing him to grip the wheel with white-knuckled intensity, while Kevin delivered the final devastating detail that caused sweat to bead along Blake's hairline, despite the car's perfectly regulated climate control. "And sir, she frequently works as an interpreter for Judge Holbrook's courtroom." Kevin's voice nearly a whisper now, as they both recognized the significance of this connection. "Who is presiding over the Williams discrimination case against Thompson Media next month." The name of the lawsuit that had consumed Blake's legal team for the past year, hanging in the air between them like a guillotine blade as Blake processed this catastrophic convergence of circumstances. The city lights reflected in fractured patterns across the rain-soaked asphalt. As Blake's Tesla sliced through puddles, each splash sending water cascading over unsuspecting pedestrians, huddled under awnings, much as his own actions had just sent ripples through his carefully constructed world, creating waves that threatened to drown the reputation he had spent decades building, all because he had assumed a black waitress wouldn't understand the private language he had learned for his deaf cousin, but primarily used for making comments he didn't dare speak aloud. Amara turned her key in the third lock, the one they had installed after the break-in last spring, and pushed open the door to the modest 2-bedroom apartment where warmth and the scent of simmering beans with ham hocks immediately enveloped her like a familiar embrace, temporarily washing away the residual tension from her confrontation with Blake Thompson. Books lined every available surface, stacked on coffee tables and crowding the narrow hallway shelves, their spines bearing titles ranging from Advanced Syntax in American Sign Language to Judicial Procedures and Court Etiquette, the accumulated knowledge of her academic journey. creating a literal fortress of learning around their small living space where her 16-year-old brother Marcus sat cross-legged on the floor, textbooks spread around him like fallen soldiers, while his hearing aids rested on the coffee table beside a half-empty glass of orange juice. "You're late," he signed with teenage impatience, though the worry in his eyes betrayed genuine concern as Amara set down her purse and kicked off her sensible black shoes that had carried her through an 8-hour shift of navigating between tables and egos with equal dexterity. "Bus was delayed." She signed back, the lie flowing easily from her fingers to protect him from the ugliness she had encountered, before switching to their practiced routine of homework review as she settled beside him to check his physics problems while keeping one eye on their grandmother who dozed in the worn recliner by the window, her breath creating a gentle rhythm that had been the soundtrack to Amara's life since childhood. The apartment was cramped by any standard, with the dining table doubling as Amara's desk and the living room transforming into Marcus's bedroom each night when the sofa converted to his bed. But what it lacked in square footage, it made up for in the invisible currency of love and sacrifice that had sustained their small family through challenges that would have broken less resilient spirits. Her grandmother stirred as Amara moved to the kitchen to prepare chamomile tea, her arthritic hands reaching for the crocheted blanket that had slipped from her lap, her eyes sharp despite her 87 years, as they followed her granddaughter's movements with the practiced observation of someone who had raised 2 generations and could read unspoken troubles in the set of shoulders or the force used to close a cabinet door. "You carrying something heavy tonight, child?" she stated rather than asked, her Louisiana accent growing more pronounced in the evening hours, as if the day's efforts to adapt to northern speech patterns gradually surrendered to her authentic voice. Amara hesitated before the sink, weighing the burden of sharing her humiliation against protecting her grandmother from unnecessary worry, but years of transparency won out as she described the incident at Le Chateau, while carefully monitoring her grandmother's blood pressure through the subtle indicators of color in her cheeks and steadiness of her hands. "I could report him. Maybe call that reporter from the Tribune who covered the discrimination story last year. But we need my job, Graham, with Marcus's new hearing aids and your medication," Amara confessed, the practical reality of their financial situation tempering her righteous anger as it had countless times before when principle collided with necessity in the complex calculus of survival. Her grandmother set down her teacup with deliberate care, the fine china, a remnant from a more prosperous time before illness and death had reshaped their family, her gaze drifting toward the small shelf where family photos chronicled their journey across decades and hardships. "When I was 17, working at that hotel in Birmingham," she began in the storytelling cadence that signaled an important lesson was forthcoming. "The owner's son thought he could put his hands wherever he pleased on the colored girls who cleaned the rooms," her eyes taking on the distant quality that appeared whenever she revisited the segregated south of her. Youth where indignities large and small were daily occurrences to be weathered like unpredictable weather. "One Tuesday morning I reported him to the manager, knowing full well I'd lose my job for speaking up," she continued, her fingers absently tracing the embroidered edge of her napkin while Marcus, who had moved closer to better read their lips, watched with the solemn attention he always gave to his grandmother's histories. And sure enough, I was on the street by lunchtime with no reference, and 6 younger siblings depending on my wage. The familiar narrative taking an unexpected turn as she reached for Amara's hand across the small table that had hosted thousands of family meals and difficult conversations. "What I never told you was that 3 other girls came forward after me, and that man's daddy had to send him away when the local paper got wind of it," she revealed with the satisfied smile of someone who had kept a secret victory close for decades. "And 2 months later, I found a better job at the courthouse where I met your grandfather," her weathered fingers squeezing Amara's with surprising strength as the connection between past and present crystallized. Between them, the unbroken line of dignity maintained across generations of women who refused to accept diminishment as their birthright. regardless of the immediate cost. The private elevator opened directly into Blake's 40th floor penthouse, where floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the glittering cityscape below, the rain having passed to reveal a metropolitan canvas of lights and shadows that typically filled him with a sense of ownership and accomplishment, but tonight merely reflected the turbulence of his thoughts as he dropped his keys onto the white marble console table with uncharacteristic carelessness. The minimalist space, featured last year in Architectural Digest, surrounded him with carefully curated evidence of success. From the original Rothko hanging in the entryway to the custom Italian furniture arranged with mathematical precision across the gleaming hardwood floors, each element selected to communicate power and discernment to anyone fortunate enough to be admitted to this rarefied altitude of wealth. Blake loosened his tie with an impatient tug, just as his 20-year-old daughter Zoe emerged from the guest bedroom that had remained essentially unchanged since she moved to her university campus housing 3 years earlier. Her presence in his home now limited to occasional visits that felt increasingly like diplomatic missions between estranged nations rather than family reunions. "Dad, you're late," she observed without accusation, her voice containing the measured neutrality she had adopted in recent years when addressing him, a stark contrast to the adoration that had once colored her childhood interactions with the father, whose attention and approval she had desperately sought before college and activism had reshaped her worldview. Blake registered her appearance with the automatic assessment of someone accustomed to making snap judgments, noting her hair now featured purple streaks that would photograph poorly at the charity gala next month, and the simple linen clothing that deliberately rejected the designer labels he had once lavished upon her, small rebellions that he typically chose to ignore rather than escalate into the full-scale confrontations that had characterized her final year of high school. "I've been waiting to discuss the internship proposal for underprivileged youth at Thompson Media," she continued, gesturing toward the laptop and presentation materials spread across the glass dining table that rarely hosted actual meals, the proposal representing weeks of careful preparation within her social justice fellowship program, though Blake could focus only on how the term underprivileged now triggered associations with the waitress who had humiliated him hours earlier. "Can we do this tomorrow?" he deflected while pouring himself 3 fingers of 18-year-old scotch, the amber liquid sloshing dangerously close to the crystal rim as his hand betrayed his lingering agitation. "I've had a complicated evening with a situation that could impact our legal position, offering the barest minimum of explanation while calculating how to minimize potential damage from the restaurant incident." Zoe's expression shifted subtly from hopeful to resigned, a transformation Blake might have noticed had he not been so thoroughly self-absorbed, her shoulders squaring slightly as she recognized yet another dismissal in a lifetime collection of moments when her father's business concerns had superseded her needs and interests. "Actually, that's why tonight matters." She pressed forward with the determination he might have admired had it been directed towards something he valued, like law school or an MBA rather than what he considered performative activism, "because your company's public image on inclusion directly impacts whether my proposal has any credibility." Her laptop screen illuminating her features with blue light that emphasized the structural similarity of their jawlines, the genetic echo of his own stubborn persistence reflected in her refusal to be sidelined, when Blake reluctantly settled across from her with an impatient sigh. Zoe launched into her presentation with practiced efficiency, her points landing with the precision of someone who had anticipated and prepared for every potential objection until she mentioned her deaf classmate Tyler, who had experienced workplace discrimination that went unaddressed, triggering a visceral reaction in Blake, whose fingers tightened around his tumbler as unwelcome parallels to his evening confrontation threatened his already fragile composure. "These people need to understand the real world doesn't cater to everyone's special circumstances," he interrupted sharply, the scotch amplifying his defensive posture as he leaned forward. "Businesses can't bend over backwards accommodating every person who has different needs. his voice rising as Zoe's expression hardened into the familiar mask she wore whenever her father revealed the philosophical gulf between them. Their conversation rapidly deteriorated from discussion to confrontation, with Zoe pointing out the legal and ethical obligations businesses had toward disabled employees, while Blake responded with increasingly transparent concerns about profit margins and shareholder expectations, their exchange laying bare not just their ideological differences, but the profound disconnection between a father who prioritized status and a daughter who valued justice, the emotional cost of Blake's prejudices manifesting in real time as he watched Zoe gather her materials with the careful movements of someone containing volcanic disappointment, his wealth and power utterly useless in bridging the chasm his own attitudes had created, with the only family member who still attempted to maintain a relationship with him. Le Chateau hummed with the elegant symphony of fine dining the following evening, silverware clinking against bone china, as murmured conversations floated between tables draped in pristine white linen, while Amara delivered a tray of colourful appetizers to table 12, her professional smile masking the exhaustion of having spent her morning transcribing depositions before rushing to her afternoon classes and then directly to her evening shift. The restaurant's hushed atmosphere suddenly thickened when Blake Thompson strode through the main entrance with 3 expensively dressed companions, his commanding presence drawing subtle attention despite the clientele accustomed to power and celebrity, while Amara's spine stiffened involuntarily as she sensed his arrival before actually seeing him, her body's warning system activating like prey detecting a predator. The maitre escorted Blake's party to a prime corner table, unfortunately situated directly within Amara's section despite Gabriel's attempt to arrange otherwise, leaving her no choice but to continue her duties with the additional burden of navigating this unwelcome reunion that sent adrenaline coursing through her system for the second time in 24 hours. Blake's gaze slid across her without acknowledgement as he settled into his chair, his studied casualness betraying his awareness as clearly as a shout would have, while he focused intently on his companions who represented the strategic reinforcements he had assembled since their last encounter, his armor against potential fallout. Amara approached their table with practiced professionalism, noting that Blake's party included 2 older men with the confident bearing of executives, but it was the third guest who captured her attention, a black woman in her 50s wearing a tailored crimson suit whose authoritative presence suggested someone accustomed to commanding attention in rooms far more intimidating than an upscale restaurant. "Good evening. I'm Amara, and I'll be your server tonight," she announced with the perfect blend of deference and confidence required by establishments catering to the wealthy, her eyes briefly meeting Blake's with cool professionalism that revealed nothing of their previous interaction while she distributed menus and recited the evening specials with flawless precision. The woman in red studied Amara with unusual intensity before introducing herself. "Diane Reynolds, pleased to meet you," extending her hand in a gesture uncommon from patrons to waitstaff, the name registering immediately in Amara's mind as belonging to the prominent civil rights attorney whose reputation for dismantling discriminatory corporate practices had earned her both admiration and animosity throughout the prominent civil rights business community. Blake's expression tightened almost imperceptibly as he watched this exchange, his fingers drumming a nervous tattoo against the tablecloth before he abruptly redirected attention to the wine list with exaggerated interest, his behavior signaling discomfort that only someone trained in reading body language might detect. As Amara retreated to retrieve their drink orders, she overheard snippets of conversation drifting from their table, her court-trained ears automatically processing information others might miss, including Blake's carefully modulated explanation to Diane Reynolds about those problematic emails from HR that had been appropriately handled and would never surface during discovery, his confident assurance that our legal team has isolated those complaints, immediately triggering Amara's professional understanding of evidence suppression in discrimination cases. Throughout the meal, Amara maintained her role while mentally documenting each damning statement, Blake growing increasingly relaxed and careless with his admissions as the wine flowed freely, clearly assuming the background staff existed in some separate dimension where words spoken at their table remained magically contained, never suspecting that the waitress efficiently refilling water glasses and delivering perfectly timed courses possessed the legal vocabulary and contextual understanding to recognize exactly how Thompson Media was manipulating evidence in what she now understood must be the Williams discrimination case that had been featured in recent legal journals. The evening progressed with excruciating slowness, the weight of what Amara was witnessing growing heavier with each revelation, particularly when she caught Diane Reynolds watching Blake with an expression that suggested professional skepticism beneath her cordial veneer, creating a triangle of unspoken knowledge where each person held pieces of a truth that, if fully assembled, would dramatically alter the balance of power currently tipped so decisively in Blake Thompson's favor, as he continued explaining exactly how his company planned to bury evidence of systematic discrimination against minority employees, blissfully unaware that his words were falling on ears uniquely qualified to understand both their legal implications and moral bankruptcy. Amara slipped into the ladies' room during a brief lull in service, the door swinging shut behind her to muffle the ambient restaurant noise and replace it with the gentle tinkling of the crystal chandelier that hung above marble countertops and gold-plated fixtures, the extravagant bathroom embodying the same opulence as the dining area, while serving as a momentary sanctuary for both wealthy patrons and exhausted staff alike. She leaned against the cool marble, allowing herself 30 seconds of closed eyes and deep breathing while mentally calculating the hours until her shift ended, and the pages of reading still awaiting her attention for tomorrow's linguistics seminar, the constant juggling of responsibilities having become so normal that she rarely acknowledged the extraordinary discipline it required. The bathroom door opened with a whisper of well-oiled hinges, sending Amara's hands automatically to smoothing her apron and checking her appearance in the ornate mirror before she recognized Diane Reynolds entering the space with purposeful strides, her crimson suit creating a striking contrast against the cream and gold surroundings as their eyes met in the reflective surface with a spark of mutual recognition that transcended their current server-patron dynamic. "Miss Jackson, I thought that was you," Diane stated rather than asked, her confident tone indicating certainty as she positioned herself at the adjacent sink. Close enough for private conversation while maintaining a respectful distance. "You've interpreted for Judge Holbrook's court on the Martinez case and the Browning arbitration," she continued while retrieving a lipstick from her clutch bag with practiced movements that did nothing to disguise her careful observation of Amara's reaction. "You have an excellent memory, Miss Reynolds," Amara acknowledged with professional courtesy, her posture straightening almost imperceptibly as she shifted from waitress to colleague, the transition subtle but unmistakable to someone as observant as the attorney who had built her reputation on noticing details others overlooked. The bathroom's lavish surroundings suddenly seemed to emphasize the situational power disparity between them, one woman wearing a uniform that marked her as service staff, while the other carried a handbag worth more than Amara's monthly rent. Yet the attorney's next words bridged that artificial gap with unexpected directness. "Thompson Media is being investigated for systemic discrimination against minority employees," Diane revealed in a hushed tone that nonetheless carried absolute clarity, her eyes never leaving Amara's face as she continued applying her lipstick with mechanical precision while delivering information that transformed the marble bathroom into something far more consequential than a luxury restroom. "We have 17 complainants, but insufficient documentary evidence to overcome their aggressive defense tactics and buried records," she continued, capping her lipstick with a decisive click that punctuated the gravity of her statement. While Amara processed the implications, her mind racing through potential consequences with the rapid assessment of someone accustomed to calculating risks against principles. The chandelier light fractured across the gold fixtures, casting prism-like patterns that danced across both women's features, as Diane turned to face Amara directly, abandoning all pretense of casual bathroom conversation as she lowered her voice further still. "I noticed how carefully you were listening to our table conversation, and how your expression changed when Blake mentioned certain documents being handled, her observation confirming what Amara had believed impossible, that her professional neutrality had momentarily slipped, allowing someone as perceptive as Diane Reynolds to detect her recognition of legally significant information. The weight of unspoken possibilities hung in the air between them, heavier than the expensive perfume that permeated the space. As Amara calculated the cost of involvement against her family's precarious financial stability, her grandmother's medication needs, her brother's educational future, and her own academic aspirations, all balanced against what she had witnessed and what remained the right thing to do regardless of personal consequence. "I have never approached a witness this way before," Diane admitted with rare vulnerability that momentarily softened her formidable demeanor. "But I recognized something in you yesterday that suggested you understand what's at stake for the people Thompson has harmed." Her words carefully avoiding direct solicitation, while nonetheless making clear the moral crossroads at which Amara now stood. "Sometimes justice needs a witness willing to speak," Diane added quietly as she gathered her belongings, preparing to return to the table where Blake Thompson continued his meal in blissful ignorance of the conversation transpiring mere yards away, her parting words hanging in the perfumed air like both invitation and challenge, leaving Amara alone with her reflection and the most consequential decision of her 28 years, the crystal chandelier light fragmenting across the marble countertop in patterns that somehow resembled the branching pathways of choices and their infinite consequences that now stretched before her. Blake's attention drifted from his dining companion's conversation about quarterly projections when he noticed Diane Reynolds returning from the restroom, her confident stride and satisfied expression triggering an instinctive alarm in his threat detection system, honed by decades of corporate maneuvering and power plays. His gaze followed her path backward, landing on Amara, emerging from the same door moments later, their sequential timing and the subtle nod exchanged between them, igniting sparks of paranoia that rapidly consumed his thoughts like wildfire through dry brush as his mind raced through possibilities and implications while his fingers mechanically twirled the stem of his wineglass in false nonchalance. Throughout the remainder of the meal, Blake maintained his practiced smile and rehearsed anecdotes while internally calculating risk assessments and damage control strategies, his attention splitting between appearing engaged with his guests and tracking Amara's movements around the restaurant floor with peripheral vision that missed nothing as suspicion crystallized into certainty that something transpired between the waitress and the attorney that threatened his carefully maintained facade of corporate integrity and personal reputation. After settling the extravagant bill with his corporate card and escorting his guests to the front entrance with effusive goodbyes, Blake doubled back through the restaurant with the practiced ease of a frequent patron, slipping past the bar and into the service corridor, where staff navigated between kitchen and dining room, the narrow hallway lined with stacked linens and service trays, creating a claustrophobic channel lit by unflattering fluorescent tubes that cast harsh shadows and stripped away the polished veneer both he and the restaurant maintained in public-facing spaces. He positioned himself strategically beside the time clock where servers would inevitably pass when ending their shifts. The space so confined that anyone moving through would necessarily come within arm's reach, a spatial advantage that had served him well in countless boardroom confrontations where physical proximity could be weaponized to establish dominance. When Amara rounded the corner with her purse and jacket in hand, clearly prepared to depart, Blake stepped forward to block her path, his considerable height allowing him to loom over her smaller frame while the narrow walls prevented easy retreat, creating an involuntary intimacy that reeked of power imbalance and calculated intimidation. "We should discuss what you think you heard at my table tonight," he began without preamble. his tone conversational despite the aggressive positioning, and what your conversation with Diane Reynolds might have entailed, watching her expression carefully for confirmation of his suspicions while reaching into his jacket to extract a checkbook and Mont Blanc pen with practiced smoothness. $20,000, he continued while scribbling the figure without breaking eye contact. For your understanding of client confidentiality and the importance of discretion in your line of work, tearing the check along its perforation with a crisp sound that sliced through the corridor's humid air before extending it between them like an offering or a test, perhaps both simultaneously. Amara's gaze dropped to the check, then returned to Blake's face with an expression that revealed nothing of her internal calculations as she stood perfectly still, neither retreating nor advancing in the confined space where his expensive cologne mingled with the industrial cleaner used on the hallway floors, creating an olfactory representation of their disparate worlds colliding in this hidden corridor, far from the chandeliers and champagne flutes of the main dining room. "My silence isn't for sale, unlike your conscience," Amara finally responded, each word precisely articulated with the clarity of someone accustomed to making herself understood in noisy courtrooms, her rejection of his offer causing Blake's expression to transform from confident expectation to something darker and more primal as the mask of civility slipped from his features like water off waxed surfaces. "Listen carefully," Blake hissed, crumpling the check and shoving it into his pocket while stepping even closer until his suit jacket brushed against her uniform. "I know 17 people in this city's restaurant industry who owe me favors, and with one phone call, you won't serve water in a dog kennel." His voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout would have in the compressed space between them. "Your academic career, your court work, your brother's opportunities, all dependent on connections and recommendations that can disappear overnight," he continued, each threatened consequence hanging in the recycled air between them, as his words codified the invisible power structures that had always governed their respective realities, despite America's pretense of meritocracy and equal opportunity. What Blake failed to notice during his calculated intimidation was the small black dome mounted in the ceiling corner behind him, its silent lens capturing their interaction in high-definition clarity, the restaurant's recently installed security system witnessing his transformation from respected businessman to common bully, preserving evidence of his true character with the dispassionate thoroughness of technology unaffected by wealth or status, adding a layer of accountability completely unknown to Blake as he delivered his final threat before turning away with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, through whatever means necessary, leaving Amara alone in the hallway with her integrity intact, but her future suddenly precarious, the weight of her refusal settling around her shoulders like a mantle of principle whose cost was yet to be determined. Amara approached Le Chateau 45 minutes before her scheduled shift the following evening, the familiar route now tinged with apprehension that tightened her shoulder muscles and quickened her pace, as memories of Blake's threats echoed in her mind with each step toward the restaurant's service entrance where staff arrived daily to transform from ordinary people into the invisible facilitators of luxury dining experiences. Her keycard emitted its usual electronic chirp when swiped across the reader, but instead of the expected green flash and click of an unlocking door, a persistent red light pulsed in silent rejection, the small LED somehow conveying the magnitude of what awaited her with its steady crimson warning. After 3 unsuccessful attempts, Amara pressed the intercom button, her stomach sinking with the leaden certainty of someone facing an outcome both feared and anticipated as Anthony, the restaurant owner, responded with uncharacteristic formality, asking her to meet him in his office rather than simply buzzing her inside as protocol dictated. The short walk around the building to the main entrance stretched into an emotional marathon as Amara mentally calculated the immediate financial implications, her mind automatically tabulating rent, groceries, medication costs, and upcoming tuition payments with the rapid-fire precision of someone accustomed to making insufficient resources cover essential needs through careful planning now thrown into disarray. Anthony's office, with its mahogany desk and vintage wine posters, had always represented the pinnacle of career advancement in restaurant hierarchy, a coveted space that staff rarely entered except for hiring, promotions, or terminations. Its atmosphere now waited with uncomfortable silence as Anthony gestured toward the visitor chair without meeting her eyes. "Blake Thompson called me personally this morning," Anthony began without preamble, his Italian accent thickening with distress as it always did during difficult conversations, his hands fidgeting with a pen that clicked rhythmically in counterpoint to his words. "Threatening to contact health inspectors, remove us from his media outlet's restaurant guides, and ensure his considerable network avoids our establishment if you remained employed here." His gaze finally rising to meet hers with genuine regret, clouding features more accustomed to expressing bonhomie toward valued customers. "I have a wife, 3 children, and 27 staff, depending on this restaurant's success," he continued, the implied conclusion hanging unspoken between them before he slid an envelope across the polished desktop, 3 weeks severance and an excellent recommendation. This final offering extended like insufficient penance for the sacrifice of principle to pragmatism that business owners made daily to survive in a world where wealth translated directly to power regardless of moral considerations. Before Amara could respond, the office door opened without a preliminary knock, revealing Gabriel in his chef's whites with Maria, Jamal, and 5 other staff members crowded behind him, their collective presence filling the modest office with a solidarity that transcended their different positions in the restaurant hierarchy as Gabriel stepped forward with uncharacteristic formality. "Mr. Anthony, with respect, we need to discuss this situation," the head chef announced while placing a thick manila folder beside the severance envelope, its worn edges suggesting frequent handling. Because Amara is not the first person Blake Thompson has targeted, merely the most recent, his statement triggering nods from the assembled staff, whose expressions reflected a shared history, previously kept segregated in individual experience, rather than recognized as systematic abuse of power. Anthony's surprise manifested in raised eyebrows and momentary speechlessness as Gabriel opened the folder to reveal meticulously documented incidents spanning 7 years, each page detailing dates, witnesses, and specific behaviors ranging from sexual harassment of female servers to racial slurs directed at kitchen staff, homophobic comments toward bartenders, and intimidation of management, all perpetrated by Blake Thompson during his regular visits while spending lavishly enough to insulate himself from consequences. "I started keeping records after he reduced Sophia to tears and cost us our previous sommelier," Gabriel explained, his thick fingers carefully turning pages that catalogued what previously existed only as break-room whispers and private commiseration. "And everyone here has signed statements about what they've witnessed or experienced directly. The collective documentation transforming isolated incidents into a damning pattern that could no longer be dismissed as misunderstanding or hypersensitivity when viewed in aggregate." Maria stepped forward, her pastry flour-dusted hands clasping Amara's shoulders with gentle firmness as she addressed their visibly shaken employer. "Mr. Anthony, we understand your business concerns, but if we don't stand together against people like Blake Thompson, nothing ever changes. And he continues hurting people because we remain divided by fear." Her simple eloquence striking the emotional chord that paperwork alone could not achieve. Jamal nodded before adding his perspective with quiet intensity. "My father lost his restaurant in 1987 when he stood up to local businessmen who wanted him gone because they didn't think a black man should own property downtown." The personal history landing heavily in the crowded office, and he always said his biggest regret wasn't losing the business but losing his self-respect by not fighting harder. His testimony bridging generations of similar struggles against entrenched power that maintained itself partly through the isolation of those who might otherwise collectively challenge it. Anthony stared at the assembled staff, his entrepreneurial calculations visibly shifting beyond immediate financial considerations to longer-term questions of workplace culture, personal legacy, and moral leadership as Gabriel carefully closed the folder before sliding it toward Amara with unmistakable purpose, offering both evidence and alliance with a simple statement that elevated her individual confrontation with Blake into something far more significant than a personal grievance. We all want to help you fight this man, not just for yourself, but for everyone whose voice he has silenced with money and threats. The collective nodding of heads around him, transforming what had begun as a termination meeting into the first gathering of an unexpected coalition bound together by shared experience and newfound determination to challenge a system that had previously appeared too powerful to oppose. The text message arrived from an unknown number 3 days after Amara's termination, its brevity and mysterious content enough to pique her interest despite her general wariness of anonymous communications during this precarious time. Information about Blake Thompson that might help you. Coffee at Groundwork, tomorrow, 2 p.m., Zoe Thompson. Curiosity and cautious hope overcame her initial skepticism, leading Amara to the independent coffee shop tucked between a used bookstore and vintage record shop in the Arts District. Its deliberately mismatched furniture and local artwork creating an atmosphere of bohemian authenticity that contrasted sharply with Le Chateau's polished opulence. Warm amber lighting from repurposed industrial fixtures cast a honeyed glow across the weathered wooden tables, as the rich aroma of freshly ground beans enveloped patrons in an olfactory embrace that somehow made difficult conversations feel more manageable in this neutral territory, favored by students and creative professionals. Amara recognized Zoe immediately, despite never having met her, the young woman's features carrying unmistakable echoes of her father's in bone structure and commanding presence, though softened by compassionate eyes that suggested a fundamentally different relationship with the world, as she nervously adjusted the sleeve of her oversized cardigan while watching the door with the hypervigilance of someone raised to anticipate judgment from all directions. Their eyes met across the crowded space, mutual recognition flowing between them without the need for awkward scanning or raised hands, the invisible thread of shared experience with Blake Thompson, creating an immediate connection that transcended their dramatically different backgrounds. As Amara navigated between tables toward this unexpected potential ally, whose existence had never factored into her calculations until now. "Thank you for coming," Zoe began after they exchanged brief introductions, her voice carrying the same authoritative timbre as her father's, yet employed with genuine warmth rather than intimidation, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her ceramic mug, while gathering courage for what clearly constituted an act of familial betrayal, according to the value system in which she had been raised. "My father has a 20-year history of comments and behaviors that would destroy him professionally if made public," she continued with clinical detachment that barely masked the emotional complexity beneath. Racist jokes at dinner parties, misogynistic comments about female executives, mockery of disabilities, and systematic undermining of diversity initiatives within his own company. Each example landing between them like stones disturbing still water, ripples of implication expanding outward with each revelation. Amara listened without interruption, years of court interpretation having taught her the value of allowing people to tell their stories without premature response, noting how Zoe's shoulders gradually relaxed as she unburdened herself of secrets long carried in isolation, the younger woman's evident relief suggesting this confession served purposes beyond merely providing evidence against her father. "I've spent years trying to reconcile loving the man who taught me to ride a bike and checked under my bed for monsters with the executive who casually destroys careers and mocks vulnerable people," Zoe admitted, raw honesty breaking through her composed exterior as she reached into her messenger bag to extract a small digital recorder that she placed on the table between them, its unassuming plastic casing belying the potentially explosive content it contained. 6 recordings from family dinners and private conversations at our home," she explained, sliding the device toward Amara with the solemnity of someone transferring something precious and dangerous simultaneously, including his explicit instructions to HR about burying discrimination complaints and specific strategies for hiding evidence from attorneys like Diane Reynolds, her voice dropping to ensure privacy despite the ambient coffee shop noise that provided convenient acoustic cover for their conversation. "Why are you doing this?" Amara asked, the question unavoidable despite potentially derailing this unexpected gift, her ingrained caution preventing immediate acceptance without understanding the complex motivations that might lead a daughter to provide incriminating evidence against her own father, particularly given the vast socio-economic gap between them that historically incentivized solidarity within privileged classes rather than alliance across social divides. Zoe's gaze dropped momentarily to the scarred wooden tabletop before rising to meet Amara's with newfound steadiness, her response emerging not as defensive justification but as hard-won personal truth. "Because I've spent my entire life watching him hurt people who look like you while benefiting from systems designed to protect people who look like me, and I finally understood that my silence makes me complicit." The simple statement encapsulating years of internal struggle and moral evolution that had brought her to this coffee shop with evidence against her own father. The unexpected tears that briefly filmed Zoe's eyes spoke more eloquently than her words about the personal cost of her choice, though she blinked them away with the practiced composure of someone raised to view emotional display as weakness, her next words emerging with quiet certainty that suggested a foundational shift in her understanding of belonging. "Sometimes family isn't who raises you, but who shares your values." The declaration hanging between them like a bridge spanning their different worlds, offering the possibility that solidarity might transcend the boundaries of race, class, and background that had previously separated their experiences, but not their fundamental humanity or commitment to justice. Diane Reynolds' law office bore little resemblance to the sleek corporate spaces that housed Thompson Media's legal team, her priorities evident in the allocation of resources that favored substance over appearance, with mismatched furniture that privileged comfort over aesthetic, walls lined with overflowing bookshelves rather than abstract art, and every horizontal surface covered with precisely organized case files that mapped the trajectory of her 30-year career fighting corporate discrimination. Amara navigated the narrow path between stacked bankers' boxes containing witness statements and expert testimony for the Williams case, each carefully labeled and color-coded, according to Diane's meticulous system that transformed apparent chaos into functional order, the physical manifestation of a legal mind that found patterns within complexity and constructed narratives from fragmented evidence. "Your recordings and testimony have transformed our case from circumstantial to compelling," Diane explained while arranging documents across her desk where coffee rings marked late nights spent pursuing justice with the same relentlessness that corporate attorneys applied to avoiding it. "The security footage from the restaurant hallway corroborates your account of Blake's intimidation tactics, and Gabriel's documentation establishes a pattern of behavior that undermines their claim that discrimination complaints were isolated incidents, her experienced hands sorting exhibits with practiced efficiency. Outside the window, rain pelted the glass in percussive rhythms that underscored the gravity of their preparation, as Amara studied her deposition transcript, highlighting inconsistencies between Blake's sworn statements and the reality captured in Zoe's recordings, her court experience providing valuable insight despite her unaccustomed role as witness rather than interpreter. "The Tribune ran the story this morning," Diane noted, gesturing toward the newspaper whose headline proclaimed, "Thompson Media faces explosive discrimination allegations," the article detailing multiple claims from former employees whose stories aligned with disturbing broad precision, and every major outlet except those owned by Thompson has picked it up, creating public pressure that complicated Blake's preferred strategy of quiet settlements and non-disclosure agreements. Amara's phone chimed with another message from her brother, expressing support alongside a photo of their grandmother proudly holding the newspaper, their encouragement simultaneously strengthening her resolve and intensifying her awareness of potential consequences. As Blake's threats against her future employment opportunities loomed like storm clouds on the horizon of her professional aspirations. "What if I freeze on the stand?" Amara whispered, the question emerging unbidden from the place where confidence fractured against fear, her fingers unconsciously tracing the edge of the deposition transcript, as if seeking reassurance from the familiar texture of legal documents that had previously represented her livelihood rather than her vulnerability. "Thompson's attorneys will attempt to discredit you by any means necessary," Diane acknowledged with characteristic frankness, never sugarcoating difficult truths for clients or witnesses regardless of their emotional state. "They'll question your motives, suggest financial incentives, imply vindictiveness after being fired, and attempt to undermine your credibility through manufactured inconsistencies. Each tactic outlined with clinical precision born of decades watching corporate defense teams employ predictable strategies against witnesses who threatened their clients' carefully maintained public images and financial interests. The weight of responsibility settled across Amara's shoulders with newfound heaviness as she contemplated how her testimony would affect not only her own future, but the 17 complainants whose cases depended on establishing patterns of discrimination that Blake had systematically concealed through institutional power and individual intimidation, her personal experience suddenly inseparable from a larger struggle for workplace dignity that transcended her specific circumstances. "Remember that nervousness reads as authenticity to most jurors," Diane advised while demonstrating proper posture and eye contact for effective testimony, "and that you only need to tell your truth exactly as you experienced it without embellishment or apology." Her guidance reflecting decades of courtroom experience, where justice often hinged on whether truth could withstand the orchestrated assault of well-paid attorneys whose expertise lay in creating doubt where certainty had previously existed. The afternoon sunlight briefly pierced the cloud cover to cast golden rectangles across the cluttered office, illuminating dust motes that danced between them, like visible manifestations of the swirling tensions and possibilities that surrounded this case, which had expanded from individual grievance to potential landmark precedent through the convergence of Gabriel's documentation, Zoe's recordings, and Amara's testimony, creating a foundation strong enough to challenge a media empire built partly upon suppressed complaints and intimidated silence. "Truth is powerful," Diane acknowledged while gathering the final exhibits for tomorrow's proceedings, her voice carrying the weathered wisdom of someone who had witnessed both triumph and heartbreak in pursuit of justice. "But those in power rarely surrender it willingly." The simple observation encapsulating decades of structural resistance to accountability that required extraordinary courage from ordinary people who risked personal consequences by speaking against systems designed to protect those who controlled resources, media narratives, and legal advantages that traditionally insulated wealth from consequences regardless of behavior. Courtroom 3 of the County Superior Court building imposed its authority through architectural gravitas, its soaring ceilings and mahogany paneling designed specifically to humble all who entered regardless of station, wealth, or confidence. The formal setting, transforming personal conflicts into matters of legal record and private behaviors into public testimony, subject to evaluation against societal standards rather than individual justification. Amara's heels clicked against the polished marble floor as she approached the witness stand, her charcoal grey suit selected carefully to convey professionalism without ostentation, her path taking her directly past the defense table where Blake Thompson sat between his attorneys in a bespoke suit that cost more than her monthly rent, his expression a practiced mask of benign neutrality that revealed nothing of the threatening figure who had cornered her in the restaurant hallway. The physical proximity required by courtroom protocol forced a momentary breach of the careful distance Amara had maintained since their confrontation, the scent of his distinctive cologne briefly triggering visceral memories of intimidation that she compartmentalized through the grounding techniques learned in her court interpretation training, focusing instead on the solid feel of the wooden chair beneath her as she was sworn in before Judge Holbrook, whose familiar presence provided an unexpected anchor in this unfamiliar role. Diane established the foundational narrative through measured questioning that allowed Amara to describe the initial restaurant interaction, her credentials as a certified interpreter and linguistic specialist, providing context for her fluency in American Sign Language and ability to understand Blake's insults, despite his assumption of privacy. Her testimony delivered with the clear enunciation and precise language of someone accustomed to facilitating communication rather than participating directly in legal proceedings. Blake maintained his composed facade during her account of their initial encounter, though Amara noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that betrayed discomfort as jurors' expressions reflected growing disapproval, their diverse faces registering the universal recognition of deliberate cruelty regardless of their varying backgrounds, as her description of his mocking signs and subsequent shock resonated across demographic lines with uncomfortable familiarity. The atmosphere shifted perceptibly when security footage from the restaurant hallway played on courtroom monitors, Blake's attorney objecting strenuously but unsuccessfully as the silent video captured his client's intimidating posture and Amara's evident discomfort, the visual evidence transforming subjective description into objective documentation that even the most skeptical juror could not dismiss as misinterpretation or exaggeration. Leonard Whitfield, Thompson Media's lead attorney, whose reputation for aggressive cross-examination had broken numerous witnesses in previous discrimination cases, approached with calculated affability that barely disguised predatory intent, his expensive Italian loafers silent against the carpet as he positioned himself precisely in Amara's sightline while blocking her view of Diane's supportive presence. "Miss Jackson, if Mr. Thompson's behavior was so egregiously offensive as you claim," Whitfield began with exaggerated reasonableness that set immediate alarm bells ringing in Amara's mind. "Why did you continue working at Le Chateau after this alleged incident, rather than resigning immediately as most reasonable people would when faced with genuinely intolerable conditions?" The question crafted to create doubt about the severity of Blake's actions, by suggesting her continued employment contradicted her claims of significant distress. The courtroom fell silent as all eyes turned toward Amara, the seemingly innocuous question containing carefully laid traps designed to either minimize her experience or characterize her as financially motivated rather than genuinely harmed, the type of false dichotomy that defense attorneys routinely employed to discredit witnesses whose testimony threatened powerful clients. Amara studied Whitfield's satisfied expression, recognizing the presumption behind his question that prioritized privileged choices over working-class realities, his assumption that principled resignation represented a universal option rather than a luxury, afforded primarily to those with financial safety nets and robust professional networks. Without breaking eye contact with her questioner, Amara's hands rose between them in fluid motion, her fingers forming American Sign Language with the practiced grace of someone who had communicated this way for decades. The unexpected shift in communication method, drawing every eye in the courtroom as she signed her complete response before speaking a single word. The silent language, creating a momentary reversal of the power dynamic that had characterized her previous interactions with Blake, where spoken English dominated all exchanges. "Because dignity isn't about where you work, but how you allow others to treat you," she finally stated aloud, her voice carrying the quiet authority of personal truth rather than rehearsed testimony. The simple declaration resonating throughout the hushed courtroom as the court reporter's fingers paused briefly on her stenotype machine before continuing their mechanical documentation. "My grandmother raised me to believe that running from injustice only ensures it continues unchallenged for the next person." Amara continued while Whitfield's smug expression faltered. his planned follow-up suddenly irrelevant as she redirected the narrative from individual employment decisions to multi-generational wisdom about confronting mistreatment. And my younger brother watches how I respond when powerful people believe they can demean others without consequence. Each word dismantling the premise of the attorney's question, while subtly highlighting the broader implications of allowing wealthy individuals to determine whose humanity deserved respect based on their employment status or social position. Across the courtroom, Gabriel and her former co-workers nodded in silent support from the public seating area, while journalists scribbled furiously in notebooks, her response transcending the specific case to address universal questions about workplace dignity that resonated with countless viewers following the proceedings through media coverage, transforming a calculated attempt to undermine her credibility into a powerful articulation of principles that reflected the collective experience of anyone who had ever continued working in difficult circumstances, out of necessity rather than choice. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning with a verdict that sent tremors through corporate boardrooms across the city, finding Thomson Media guilty of systemic discrimination with punitive damages set at $28 million, alongside specific requirements for workplace policy reform, executive diversity training, and independent oversight that would fundamentally reshape the company's internal culture, despite any appeals their legal team might file in coming months. Throughout the verdict reading, Amara sat with perfect posture beside Diane, her expression betraying no emotion despite the vindication washing over her in invisible waves. As each finding acknowledged the truth of experiences long dismissed as oversensitivity or misunderstanding by those who benefited from maintaining the status quo, the official validation transforming private suffering into public record that could no longer be denied or minimized through corporate spin or intimidation tactics. Across the aisle, Blake's carefully maintained facade finally crumbled as the implications for his professional reputation and legacy crystallized with each damning finding, his complexion ashen beneath his typical tan as his phone vibrated continuously with messages from board members already distancing themselves from his leadership, the swift abandonment by former allies demonstrating how quickly power evaporates when no longer deemed advantageous to associate with its previous embodiment. News of the verdict spread through digital channels with unprecedented speed, trending across social platforms within minutes as Thomson Media's stock price dropped precipitously, financial markets responding to moral judgment with the only metric they truly understood, while competing news outlets, freed from concerns about potential advertising retaliation, covered the story with the breathless enthusiasm of those reporting on the downfall of someone previously considered untouchable. Outside the courthouse steps, rain began falling in gentle persistence as Amara emerged alongside Diane, Gabriel, her former co-workers, and the 17 Thomson Media employees whose complaints had formed the foundation of the case, their collective presence embodying the solidarity that had ultimately proven stronger than Blake's individual power, as journalists surged forward with outstretched microphones and shouted questions that blended into cacophonous urgency. "Miss Jackson, what does this verdict mean for workers facing discrimination?" called a reporter from Channel 4, her question rising above the others, with enough clarity to merit response. As Amara paused on the rain-slicked steps, water droplets clinging to her hair like miniature crystals catching the light from camera flashes, while she considered how to distill such complex emotions and implications into words worthy of this watershed moment. Today's verdict affirms what should be self-evident but often isn't acknowledged in our workplaces: that human dignity transcends job titles, that respect isn't determined by salary or status, and that even the most powerful individuals remain accountable for how they treat others, regardless of whether cameras are watching or microphones are recording. Amara responded, her voice steady despite the momentous occasion, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood the weight of language and its capacity to bridge divides or deepen them, depending on how carefully it was wielded. Rainfall intensified around them. Journalists huddling closer beneath shared umbrellas while network cameras continued broadcasting her words live across the city, where viewers in countless homes, offices, restaurants, and public spaces paused to witness this moment of reckoning between established power and emergent justice playing out in real time on their screens. This case was never solely about Mr. Thompson's behavior toward me, but about systems that have traditionally protected certain individuals from consequences while denying others basic workplace dignity. Amara continued, raindrops streaming down her face like tears she refused to shed during months of preparation and testimony, and about the courage of every person who risked their livelihood by coming forward when remaining silent would have been easier but ultimately more costly to their sense of self. Her acknowledgement causing supportive nods from the former employees clustered around her, whose individual complaints had merged into collective power strong enough to challenge institutional barriers previously considered impenetrable. From his tinted window, Tesla parked across from the courthouse. Blake watched the impromptu press conference with uncharacteristic silence, his driver respecting the gravity of the moment by refraining from platitudes about appealing or spinning the verdict that typically followed legal setbacks, leaving space for something unfamiliar to penetrate Blake's consciousness as he observed Amara speaking in the rain, surrounded by people from vastly different backgrounds, united by shared experience of his company's toxic culture that had ultimately been deemed illegal rather than merely unpleasant. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Blake Thompson saw the human consequences of his behavior reflected not through the distorting lens of power and privilege, but through the clarifying perspective of accountability. The rain-streaked window between him and the courthouse steps, symbolizing the invisible barriers that had previously insulated him from meaningful connection with those he deemed less important than himself, barriers now irrevocably breached by a waitress whose dignity had proven more resilient than his authority. As media coverage shifted to practical implications of the verdict, highlighting the unprecedented resignation letter already submitted by 2 Thompson Media board members and speculation about Blake's future with the company he had built, Amara's grandmother watched the coverage from her living room with tears streaming unchecked down weathered cheeks, her quiet pride more profound than words could express, as her granddaughter's public vindication represented not just personal triumph, but the culmination of hopes carried through generations of women who had endured similar treatment, without access to justice or platforms from which their truths might be acknowledged. 6 months transformed seasons and circumstances alike, as spring sunshine streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the newly established Bridges Communication Center, illuminating a converted warehouse space where exposed brick walls displayed artwork created by deaf artists, alongside infographics about workplace rights in multiple languages and formats. The bright, welcoming environment deliberately designed to contrast with the exclusivity of spaces like Le Chateau, where accessibility remained an afterthought rather than a foundational principle. Amara moved confidently between circular tables where diverse groups of students practiced sign language with varying degrees of proficiency, her current class including corporate executives, public school teachers, healthcare workers, and community members united by their desire to bridge communication gaps that had previously seemed insurmountable before the Thompson Media case highlighted how language differences could be weaponized to exclude rather than opportunities to connect. The settlement funds had provided seed money for the center, though Amara had insisted on creating a sustainable business model rather than relying solely on the financial windfall, her practical wisdom recognizing that lasting change required structural support beyond individual compensation, as she combined sign language instruction with corporate training on inclusive workplace practices and accessible customer service that generated revenue while advancing her broader mission of communication equity across social boundaries. Marcus worked alongside her as a teaching assistant after school, his confidence flourishing in this environment where his deafness represented specialized knowledge rather than limitation, his teenage enthusiasm infectious as he corrected finger positions and encouraged struggling students with the patience of someone who remembered his own learning process, the siblings' partnership embodying the center's core philosophy that everyone had something valuable to teach when given appropriate platforms and respect. Amara was demonstrating a particularly complex sign sequence to a group of municipal employees when the front door opened to admit unexpected visitors, whose appearance immediately sent ripples of recognition through the classroom, conversations faltering mid-sentence as students registered the significance of Blake Thompson entering this space alongside his daughter Zoe, his presence so incongruous with the environment that several people glanced toward security cameras with instinctive concern despite the months separating current reality from past confrontation. Blake's physical transformation proved as striking as his contextual displacement, his previously immaculate appearance replaced by more casual attire, while the confident posture that had previously announced his authority in any room appeared subdued by genuine uncertainty as he hovered near the entrance, clearly uncomfortable yet determined to remain, while Zoe offered encouraging nods that suggested this visit represented a significant step in some private journey they shared despite the public nature of its execution. Amara excused herself from her students with practiced professionalism that masked her internal turbulence as she approached the visitors, maintaining the poised dignity that had characterized her courthouse testimony. While processing the surreal juxtaposition of seeing Blake Thompson standing awkwardly in the center, she had built, partly from the consequences of his actions, the cosmic irony almost too perfect to be coincidental yet undeniably present as spring sunlight created halos around them through the industrial windows. "We apologize for interrupting your class." Zoe began with sincere respect that acknowledged the significance of Amara's work, rather than treating it as less important than their arrival. "But my father has something he wanted to communicate personally after completing 6 months of intensive therapy and diversity training." Her protective stance beside Blake, revealing their complicated relationship, had evolved rather than dissolved through the public reckoning that had ultimately cost him his CEO position, though not his entire fortune or family connection. Blake stepped forward with visible effort, his hands rising tentatively between them, in what Amara immediately recognized as rehearsed American Sign Language, his fingers forming signs with mechanical precision that lacked fluidity, yet demonstrated considerable practice as he slowly communicated, "I am sorry for the pain I caused you and others through my ignorance and arrogance." Each movement requiring conscious thought rather than the automatic execution that characterized fluent signers, the effort itself communicating sincerity that polished perfection might have undermined given their history and relative positions. The center fell silent as students and staff recognized the extraordinary moment unfolding before them, the former media executive humbling himself through imperfect signs that required vulnerability and commitment to learn rather than simply offering spoken words that would have demanded nothing from him beyond momentary discomfort. His willingness to communicate in Amara's language, rather than insisting she accommodate his representing tangible evidence of personal growth that transcended mere public relations management. My behavior reflected deeply rooted prejudices I never questioned, because the world rewarded rather than challenged them. Blake continued after completing his signed apology, switching to spoken English with Zoe interpreting beside him to ensure his meaning was fully accessible, and losing my position forced me to recognize how my identity had become so entwined with power that I forgot the humanity connecting us beneath superficial differences. His unscripted words lacking the polished quality of statements crafted by crisis management teams, yet carrying the imperfect authenticity of genuine reflection. Amara studied his expression with the careful assessment developed through years of reading micro-expressions in courtrooms and classrooms alike, searching for evidence of performative contrition versus genuine transformation. Her expertise in human communication, extending beyond linguistic fluency to encompass the unspoken cues that often revealed more than carefully chosen words, regardless of language or modality. "I accept your apology," she finally responded with the measured consideration of someone who understood the significance of forgiveness without conflating it with forgetting. Her response simultaneously signed and spoken to model the communication equity her center promoted, and I appreciate the effort required to learn even basic signs when you could have chosen easier paths toward reconciliation. Her acknowledgement recognizing the symbolic significance of his approach without dismissing the history that necessitated it. The spring sunshine shifted as clouds temporarily obscured the natural illumination flowing through windows, casting subtle shadows across the open space as Amara added the crucial caveat that transformed mere closure into meaningful continuation. "Understanding is just the beginning of justice." Her simple declaration acknowledging that personal growth, while essential, represented merely the foundation upon which structural change must be built, rather than the completed architecture of a truly equitable society. Blake nodded with uncharacteristic humility that suggested genuine reception of her message, rather than the performative agreement that had characterized his previous interactions with those he deemed beneath his station. His response lacking defensive qualifications or self-congratulatory overtones as he replied, "I would like to learn more, if you're willing to teach," the request indicating recognition that transformation required ongoing education rather than singular epiphanies or dramatic gestures. His willingness to position himself as student rather than authority figure, representing perhaps the most significant evidence of authentic change.